fragile Gaza ceasefire remains intact for now after militant groups agreed to hand over 3 Israeli hostages later today. Earlier in the week, Hamas had threatened to delay further release of hostages, accusing Israel of breaching the truce.
Now, there have been 5 swaps since the ceasefire came into effect about a month ago, with 21 hostages and 730 Palestinian prisoners released so far. Well, joining us now is Aaron David Miller. He's an analyst and a former Middle East negotiator with the US State Department. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
We've seen the ceasefire almost collapse earlier this week. You've been a former negotiator. Talk to us about the sort of machinations that may have been happening behind closed doors to ensure that the truce stays intact.
I mean, first of all, I think we need to understand that this is not an agreement between the United States and Australia. This is an agreement following 15 months in which Israelis and Palestinians have inflicted extraordinary trauma, violence, death and destruction on one another. And negotiations have been done indirectly. So yeah, they came up with a 3-phased agreement, but no confidence, no trust, with domestic politics constraining the options on each side. This was a crisis. It was resolved in large part because it's still within the best interests of Hamas and the government of Israel to get through phase 1, but I fear greatly that over the next several weeks, we're heading for, I think, the cratering of this agreement. I see almost no way that you're going to move into phase 2, which demands heavy lift from both Hamas and the government of Israel to complete the deal, to escalate the situation and end the war. I see absolutely no chance that that's going to happen. And I suspect we're heading back for resumption of conflict.
As you say, no confidence, no trust between the two sides. Are you surprised that the ceasefire has remained in place so far?
Not really. Why do people reach agreements? Urgency and the advantages of doing an agreement outweigh the disadvantages of preserving the status quo. I think the government of Israel needed to demonstrate. I don't think the Netanyahu government prioritizes the return of hostages. I think they have a much broader goal. And Hamas needs to trickle out hostages because it's the only card that they have left. So phase 2 demands the return of what would be, if phase 1 is implemented, roughly 59 hostages, males, mostly soldiers, that Hamas will control, 25 of whom the Israelis judge longer be alive, in return for an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners and very bad Palestinian prisoners in terms of being charged or convicted of killing Israelis. The end of the war and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, I just don't see that happening. I think the Israeli government is gearing up for another very serious round of projection of their military force in Gaza. I think they'll have the support of the U.S. president. I fear greatly that the greatest losers here are going to be the remaining hostages that are alive, and of course the civilian population of Gaza.
But at the same time, we've got US President Trump, saying that perhaps Gaza can be taken over by the United States. He has plans to develop it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Now, this, of course, has forced the Arab states to come together on February 27th at an urgent summit to discuss Gaza, the issue of Gaza. Do you think some sort of resolution could actually come from that summit?
I don't. I think if, in fact, the president used to his position of what would be tantamount to the forced, even voluntary displacement, what if 2 million people from Gaza and they would not be allowed to return? I mean, the most charitable interpretation of his proposal, which is completely untethered from reality, is that it would move key Arab states to take a greater interest in Gaza, perhaps, and you're already seeing this from the United Arab Emirates, toughening of the rhetoric against Hamas. What the government of Israel wants is for Hamas literally to cease to be a influential, let alone governing party for Gaza, and they want the expulsion, the forced expulsion of Hamas's senior leadership. The Arab states may well come back to the president and say, look, we agree with this, but the problem, of course, is going to remain how to accomplish this. So I think we really are in for some very difficult times in the weeks ahead.
You've been a former Middle East negotiator serving under the Clinton and Bush Jr. Administrations. Watching from the sidelines, are you seeing perhaps that the resolution to this Middle East conflict is getting further and further away?
Yeah, I do. I think I wouldn't lose hope or faith, frankly, because we can't see what's in front of us for good or ill. But what is missing here, everywhere, on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, on the American side, is the one ingredient, the one force that actually, when anything of positive value happened in Arab-Israeli peace, you had, which are leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies, leaders who are prepared to look beyond their own personal security and even political viability to care more about the security and prosperity of their peoples, and leaders who are prepared to face up to some very tough decisions, not just to advance their own interests, but to incorporate the interests of the other side. Mandela and de Klerk, Sadat and Begin, King Hussein and Rabin, the former Prime Minister of Israel. We don't have those leaders. And until we do, we're going to be managing at great expense, I would argue, for the security of both Israelis and, for sure, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.